Every morning, I saved the last muffin at my bakery for an old woman who never had money. "You're losing profit," my manager warned. Then one afternoon, a lawyer walked through the door with an envelope and said she had left everything to me. The lawyer had been waiting 40 minutes before I came out of the kitchen. I know because my counter assistant Bex told me afterward that he had arrived at 2:15 and refused coffee and sat in the same chair the whole time with the envelope on his knee, not looking at his phone, just waiting with the patience of someone who had delivered news like this before and understood that it required a particular quality of stillness. His name was Reginald Ossie, and he had been practicing estate law for 23 years. And when I came through the swinging door in my apron with flour on my forearms, he stood up and said my name as a question, even though he clearly already knew the answer. I said yes. He said he was sorry for my loss. I said I wasn't sure what loss he meant. He said he was here regarding the estate of Margarite Thibault, and that she had passed 4 days ago, and that she had left a will naming me as the sole beneficiary of her estate. I stood in the middle of my own bakery and felt the floor do something unreliable under my feet. And I thought about a woman with white hair and cardboard-soled shoes who had come in every single morning for 2 years and 6 months and eaten a blueberry muffin at the corner table and always left without paying, and how I had always pretended not to notice. I had opened Crestline Bakery 3 years before Marguerite first walked through the door, in a building I rented on the corner of 2 streets that the neighborhood association had recently rebranded as the Crestline Arts District, which meant the rent was increasing and the clientele was shifting, and exactly the kind of people who paid $4 for a pastry without flinching were beginning to replace the people who had lived on those streets for 30 years. I was 34 years old, had spent the previous decade working in other people's professional kitchens, and had taken every dollar I had saved and borrowed against every relationship that would allow it to open a place that was mine. The bakery was small, 9 tables, a glass counter, an open kitchen separated from the front by a half wall so customers could see the work being done. It had taken me 14 months to turn a profit, and another 8 to feel like the profit was real, rather than a rounding error that would correct itself. By the time Marguerite arrived, I was doing well enough to breathe without calculating the breath first, which was the best I had felt financially in 4 years. She came in on a Wednesday in November, the first time, at 7:30 in the morning when we had just opened and the cases were full, and the place smelled of the brown butter and lemon zest I used in the morning batch. She was 70-something, I thought at the time, though I later learned she was 81. Small, carefully dressed in the way that people who once had money dress when they no longer have it. The clothes were good quality but old, maintained with the attention of someone who understood that they could not be replaced. She wore her white hair in a low bun and carried a fabric shopping bag that was empty. She looked at the case for a long time, and then she looked at me and said she would like 1 blueberry muffin, please, and I asked if she would be having it here or taking it with her, and she said here, and I put it on a plate and brought it to her at the corner table, and she ate it slowly with her hands folded in her lap between bites like someone conducting a ceremony. When she finished, she came to the counter and said thank you and began looking in her bag in the way people look when they know what they will find, and it is not what they need. I said it was on the house today, new customer discount, which was not a thing we offered, and she looked at me for a moment with her gray eyes and said thank you again differently this time, and left. She came back the next morning, and the next. Within a week it was established without either of us acknowledging it that the blueberry muffin at the corner table was hers. She would arrive between 7:15 and 7:45. She would eat, she would thank me, and she would leave. We began to talk in the way of people who share a space regularly and gradually become comfortable in each other's presence. About the weather, about the neighborhood, about what I was baking that day. She had opinions about pastry, sharp and specific, and I came to understand she had some professional knowledge of it, though she deflected every question about her past with the practiced ease of someone who had been deflecting for years. My manager, Bex, who was 26 and deeply practical and had opinions about every operational decision I made, noticed the pattern within the first 2 weeks. She came to me on a Friday and said, with the directness she applied to everything, "You know that woman doesn't pay, right?" I said I knew. Bex said, "And you're going to keep doing it?" I said yes. Bex said, "All right, just so we both know what we're doing." She logged it as a daily comp and moved on, which was one of the many reasons I was glad to have her. The first sign that Marguerite was more complicated than she appeared came about 3 months in, when she arrived one morning looking different. Not distressed exactly, but contained in a way that was different from her usual composure, a tightness around her eyes that she was managing carefully. I brought her muffin and a cup of tea I had not been asked for, and she looked at the tea for a moment, and then looked at me and said, "You are very kind, Nadia." She used my name, which she knew from the small sign above the counter that said Nadia's Crestline in the original logo I had designed myself. I said it was just tea. She said, "No, it is never just tea." She drank it and left without saying anything else, and I stood at the counter and thought about what she had said for the rest of the morning while I worked, and I didn't know why it stayed with me the way it did except that it had the quality of something meant to be remembered. I I told myself she was just a lonely elderly woman who was grateful for small kindnesses and that I was reading too much into it. I was not reading too much into it. I just didn't know that yet. 2 months after the tea incident, a man came into the bakery in the mid-morning and stood at the counter and asked, with the specific performance of casual interest that is never actually casual, whether I knew a woman named Marguerite Thibault and whether she came in here regularly. He was about 50, well-dressed in a way that was meant to read as professional, but read to me instead as careful, the way someone dresses when they want to be taken seriously in a context they're not sure of. I said we had many regular customers and I didn't keep track of names. He left a business card, Dominic Farrow, private investigation, with a phone number and nothing else, and said if she came in, I should give him a call, that her family was concerned about her welfare. I put the card under the counter. Marguerite arrived the following morning, and I told her about the visit while I brought her muffin, describing the man without mentioning the name on the card. Her hands went still on the table. She looked at the window. Then she looked at me and asked what I had told him. I said I didn't track customers by name. Something in her face changed. Not quite relief, something more specific than that. The look of someone who has been holding a position for a long time and has just received confirmation that the ground is still solid. She said, I need to tell you something about myself, Nadia. Then she said, not today. I am not ready today, but soon. I nodded and went back to the kitchen and understood that I had just been brought to the edge of something I hadn't known was there. She told me over 3 separate mornings, parceled out in the careful way of someone who has learned not to give everything to one person at once. The short version, Marguerite Thibault had been, until 14 years ago, a woman of significant wealth, not hereditary, but built, through a combination of her own business acumen and the work of a husband, Philippe Thibault, who had died 20 years ago, and left her the management of assets she had spent the following decade maintaining and growing. She had a son, Christophe, and a daughter, Sylvie, both of whom were in their 50s, and both of whom had, over the preceding 7 years, been engaged in a sustained and methodical effort to have her declared mentally incompetent and take control of her remaining estate. The effort had been partially successful. She had been subjected to 2 competency evaluations, the second of which had produced a contested finding that her children's attorneys had used to establish a conservatorship over a portion of her assets. She had fought the conservatorship, and the fight had consumed legal fees that had reduced her liquid assets considerably. She was not destitute, but she was constrained. Her accounts were monitored, her spending was reported, and the investigator Dominic Farrow was employed by Christophe's legal team to document her movements and associations as part of an ongoing effort to demonstrate behavior that could be characterized as erratic or vulnerable. She came to the bakery on foot because she didn't own a car and because she paid cash for nothing. She didn't want documented, and a blueberry muffin with flour on my apron was the kind of small ordinary pleasure that she had decided she was allowed to take without accounting for it. I sat with all of this for several days. I thought about Dominic Farrow's business card under my counter. I thought about what it meant that Marguerite had chosen to tell me this, and why, and whether there was something being asked of me that I hadn't fully understood yet. She hadn't asked me for anything. She had never asked me for anything, except the muffin she had never technically asked for either. I thought about calling my own lawyer, a woman named Desiree Fontaine, who had helped me with the bakery's business incorporation and lease negotiations, but I couldn't articulate what I would be calling about. So instead, I continued what I had been doing. I saved the muffin, I made the tea, I listened when Marguerite talked, and I asked careful questions, and I never mentioned Dominic Farrow again. A month passed. 6 weeks. I told Bex a simplified version of what was going on, enough for her to understand why I was being careful about what I said if anyone came asking questions. Bex said, "She sounds like she's in a bad situation." I said yes. Bex said, "You're in it now too, you know." I said I knew. She put another daily comp in the log, and we did not discuss it further. The second time a representative of Christophe Thibault came to my bakery, it was not Dominic Farrow. It was a woman who introduced herself as Isabelle Roch, an associate at the family's law firm, who came on a morning when Marguerite was not there and asked to speak with me privately. I asked Bex to watch the front and took Isabelle to the small office in the back. She was polished and professionally pleasant in the way of someone who has been trained to de-escalate situations through demeanor rather than content. She explained that the Thibault family was concerned about their mother and that they understood she was a regular customer here and that they wanted to make sure I understood the full picture of her situation, including the fact that she had been assessed as having early-stage cognitive decline and was sometimes confused about financial matters and relationships. She said this with the specific smoothness of someone who had said it many times and had refined it into something that sounded like concern rather than strategy. I looked at her and thought about every conversation I had had with Marguerite over the preceding 8 months, about the precision of her memory, about the sharpness of her opinions about croissant lamination and the history of French patisserie, about the way she had described the conservatorship proceedings with the legal accuracy of someone who had spent months inside those documents. I said I appreciated her coming in and that we served many customers, and I would of course be attentive to any signs of distress in our clientele. Isabelle Roche left a card. I put it with Dominic Farrow's. I called Desiree Fontaine from the office before I went back out front. Desiree had been practicing business and civil law for 17 years and had the particular combination of warmth and precision that made her genuinely useful in difficult situations. I described everything: Margarite, the children, the conservatorship, both visits. And she listened without interrupting, and then she said, "You need to understand that you are a potential witness in an ongoing legal proceeding, and that anything you say to representatives of the opposing parties in that proceeding can be used in ways you don't control." She said she was not telling me to stop what I was doing, just to understand its context. She also said, "If this woman has told you things about her situation, she may have done so because she trusts you in a way she can't trust people who have formal roles in her life. That trust has value. Be careful with it." I said I would. She said to call her if anyone came back. Marguerite came in the following morning, and I told her about Isabelle Roche's visit. Her expression didn't change exactly, but it became more settled, more resolved, like someone who had been waiting for a next move and was now watching it arrive on schedule. She said, "They are escalating because they know I am still capable of making decisions they can't control." She said, "I need to ask you something, Nadia, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." I said I was listening. She said, "I have a meeting next week with my own attorney, a man named Bertrand Lacombe, and I would like you to come, not as a legal party, just as a witness to a conversation. I would like him to know that I have relationships outside the ones my children have documented, that I am capable of sustained connection with people who are not under their influence." I looked at her hands on the table, which were very still, and I looked at her face, which was asking me something she would not ask twice if I said no, and I said yes. Bertrand Lacombe had been practicing elder law for 26 years, and had the particular energy of someone who had spent most of those years fighting situations exactly like Marguerite's, and who had developed a deep and specific frustration with the legal machinery that made those situations possible. He was 60, lean, spoke quickly, and had a habit of finishing his own sentences with a pause that invited you to catch up rather than respond immediately. His office was full of files and the kind of organized chaos that indicates a very busy practice. He received me with genuine interest and asked me questions about Marguerite, when she arrived, what we talked about, how she presented, whether I had ever observed confusion or disorientation. I answered everything. He made notes. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He told me that Marguerite had changed her will 8 months ago, which was approximately the time she had first walked into my bakery, and that the change was being contested by her children as evidence of compromised judgment, and that the contest was the reason the conservatorship efforts had escalated, because if the will held, the conservatorship became moot. He said the will named a single beneficiary. He did not say my name. He didn't need to. I drove back to the bakery from Bertrand's office in the particular state of someone who has just received information that requires significant reorientation and is not quite sure how to begin it. I had not known about the will. I want to be clear about that because it mattered to me. I had not saved Marguerite's muffin because I expected anything in return, and I had gone to Bertrand's office because she asked me to, and because I trusted her, and none of what I had done had been done with knowledge of the will or its contents. I called Desiree from the parking lot and told her what Bertrand had told me. There was a pause. Then Desiree said, "That changes your position considerably." She said I needed to be prepared for the possibility that the children's attorneys would attempt to characterize my relationship with Marguerite as predatory or calculating, that this was the standard response when wills were contested, and the beneficiary was someone outside the family. She said, "Anything you have done in the last 8 months that can be documented as a pattern of care without expectation of return becomes your defense. The daily comps in Bex's log, the visits, the conversations, the fact that you never asked her for anything. Document all of it." I drove back to the bakery and asked Bex to pull the comp records going back to Marguerite's first visit, and I kept them in a folder I labeled carefully and kept in the office safe. The months that followed were the most complicated of my adult life, and also, in some ways, the most clarifying. Bertrand Lacombe filed a motion to uphold the will and provided Marguerite's most recent cognitive assessment, conducted by a neuropsychologist named Dr. Anastasia Werfel, who had 20 years of experience in geriatric cognition, and who had found no evidence of impairment affecting Marguerite's ability to understand or direct her own affairs. The children's attorneys submitted a counter-assessment from a different evaluator. These situations, Bertrand told me, often came down to competing expert testimony, which was one of the reasons they were so difficult to resolve cleanly. I was listed as a potential witness. Dominic Farrow submitted a surveillance report to the opposing counsel documenting Marguerite's visits to my bakery, her arrival times, the duration of her visits, the fact that she never paid. The report characterized the relationship as potentially exploitative. I read this description of 2 years of blueberry muffins and tea and conversations about croissant technique and the history of the Thibault family, and felt something in my chest that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. The crisis I hadn't anticipated arrived in the form of a phone call from Bertrand at 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning, before I had even opened the bakery. He said the opposing counsel had filed an emergency motion to depose me within 48 hours, citing newly obtained evidence that they claimed demonstrated a financial relationship between me and Margarite that predated the will change. He said he didn't know what the evidence was yet, but that I needed to come to his office that morning. I hung up and stood in my kitchen at home and thought about every interaction I had ever had with Margarite Thibault, and whether there was anything that could be characterized in a way I had not anticipated. There wasn't. There was nothing. But nothing and the legal presentation of nothing are different things, and I had lived inside that difference for 6 months, and I understood how much the framing mattered. I called Desiree. I called Bex to open without me. I drove to Bertrand's office. The evidence turned out to be a bank transfer record. 14 months before Margarite first visited my bakery, a sum of $11,000 had been deposited into an account associated with Crestline Bakery's business registration, from an account that had no name attached, but which the opposing counsel's investigators had traced to a subsidiary of a holding company that had once been associated with Philippe Thibault's estate. The claim was that Margarite had been a financial investor in my bakery before our relationship began, and that the muffin arrangement was not generosity, but transaction management, that she had bought access to a compliant companion, rather than simply received kindness. I sat in Bertrand's office and thought about the $11,000 and tried to remember where it had come from. Early-stage bakery financing is a scramble of small amounts from many sources: loans from friends, a crowdfunding campaign, a small business grant, a private loan from my uncle. I called my uncle from the parking lot of Bertrand's office. He said yes. He had arranged that particular loan through a contact he knew from his own business world, that the contact had wanted to remain anonymous, that he had understood it was a condition of the loan and had not questioned it. He said the contact's name, which he had been given only once, had been a woman named M. Thibault. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. She had invested in me before she ever walked through my door. I turned this over for several days, trying to understand what it meant and what she had intended. The charitable interpretation was that she had seen something worth investing in. The bakery's crowdfunding page, perhaps, or the local press I had received before the opening, and had done so anonymously because she didn't want the relationship complicated by financial history. That Margarite had encountered the bakery in some other way, recognized the address, and decided to see for herself what she had put money into. That the muffins had been a form of collecting on an investment she chose never to claim. The less charitable interpretation, the one the opposing counsel wanted the court to see, was that I had known about the investment all along, that the relationship had been manufactured from the beginning, that everything I had done was calculated. Bertrand told me the charitable interpretation was the true one based on the evidence, and that he would demonstrate it. He demonstrated it over 3 months of legal proceedings that I will not describe in full because the full description would take longer than this story. But the core of the demonstration was this. The investment had been made anonymously through 3 layers of corporate structure. The money had been treated by my accountant as a private business loan with no identified lender, and there was no documentary trail connecting Margarite to the investment that I had ever had access to. Desiree provided an affidavit from my accountant, Petra Hakala, who had 18 years of experience and had managed my books from before the opening, and who confirmed that the source of the loan had been unidentified at the time it was received and had remained unidentified in the records. The deposition happened. I answered 4 hours of questions from the opposing counsel in the presence of Bertrand and Desiree, and I answered them with the precision of someone who had spent weeks reviewing every detail of the preceding 2.5 years. I described the muffins. I described the tea. I described every conversation I could document. I described Isabelle Roche's visit, and Dominic Farrow's card under the counter, and my call to Desiree and my attendance at Bertrand's office, and the 289 daily comp entries in Bex's log. I described what Margarite had told me about the conservatorship, and what she had said about her children, and what she had said about trust. I described finding out about the will in Bertrand's office, and what I had felt and what I had done afterward. I was asked several times whether I had known about the investment. I said no, each time cleanly, without elaboration, because the answer was complete and did not require decoration. Bertrand told me afterward that my deposition was the strongest testimony he had received in a contested will proceeding in 15 years. I went home and ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter and went to bed at 8 o'clock and slept for 10 hours. The will was upheld 6 weeks later. Judge Colette Moreau, who had been on the probate bench for 11 years, ruled that the evidence presented by the opposing counsel did not meet the standard required to establish undue influence or compromised cognition, and that the independent cognitive assessment by Dr. Werfel, cross-referenced with the documentary record of Margarite's legal engagement over the preceding 3 years, demonstrated a woman in full possession of her faculties who had made a deliberate decision about the distribution of her estate. The conservatorship motion was denied on the same grounds. Christophe and Sylvie Thibault were ordered to pay a portion of Bertrand's fees, which the judge noted had been necessitated by a contest she characterized in her written ruling as insufficiently supported by evidence. I read the ruling in Bertrand's office, and then I sat in the parking lot of a coffee shop around the corner for 20 minutes before I felt capable of driving. The estate was larger than I had understood. Margarite had, despite the conservatorship battle and the legal fees and the monitored accounts, retained a significant portion of what Philippe Thibault had left her, managed across a complex of assets that Bertrand and his team spent 2 months inventorying. The total, after legal fees and taxes, was just over $1.4 million. There was also a letter, handwritten, sealed with my name on the outside, that Bertrand gave me in the same envelope as the formal estate documentation. I opened it in my car. It was 4 paragraphs long. I will not reproduce it fully, but I will tell you what it said in the way that mattered most. She wrote that she had invested in my bakery before she met me because she had read about it in a local business profile, and something in the description. A woman who had spent her career in other people's kitchens and wanted one of her own had reminded her of herself at 34. She wrote that she had visited not to inspect her investment but out of curiosity, and that what she had found was someone who had given her a muffin and pretended not to notice when she couldn't pay for it, and that this small act had been the most dignified thing anyone had done for her in 3 years. She wrote that she had changed her will because she believed the people who treated you with dignity when they had nothing to gain from it were the people your legacy should go to. She wrote, "You kept me company in my last years, and you never made me feel like a burden or an object or an obligation. You made me feel like a person. That is worth more than any amount of money. But I have the money, and I hope it is useful. I kept the bakery. I want to be clear about that because people have asked. I kept it, and I still work in it every morning, still wake at 5 and put the first batch in by 6 and open at 7. I used a portion of the estate to eliminate the remaining business debt and make some renovations I had been deferring. I used another portion to establish a small endowment through the Neighborhood Community Foundation for elderly residents facing food insecurity, which felt like the right shape for what the money wanted to do. I hired a third staff member so Bex doesn't have to cover alone when I'm in the kitchen. I added a corner table to the arrangement that had always been Margarite's. A better chair, better light. It's where I sit when I eat my own breakfast before opening, which I never used to do because there was never time, and now there is. Bertrand Lacombe stops in occasionally. Desiree comes in on Friday mornings. Dr. Werfel came in once after reading about the case in the local legal journal and shook my hand and said she had rarely written an assessment she was as confident in. Dominic Farrow, the private investigator, never came back.